Create more variation. Io ho fermato la memoria. La mano. Brava. Io fa male.
Over the course of years, following his publication of Origin of the Species, Charles Darwin immediately found himself supremely puzzled by the fact that the most dominant behavioral patterns in the natural world did not neatly fit into his world-famous theory of continuously ongoing evolution through natural selection. While as a matter of fact, according to the June 2013 article by the science director of Stanford University's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research, the highly influential body of work most closely associated with the term survival of the fittest should have actually been described as the survival of the kindest. Indeed, in The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, Darwin argued for the greater strength of the social or maternal instincts more than any other instinct or motive. In another passage, he comments that communities which included the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. Compassion may indeed be a naturally evolved and adaptive trait. Without it, the survival and flourishing of our species would have been unlikely. And yet, in spite of the fact that kindness and compassion formed the basic foundation of his theories, Charles Darwin's legacy eventually came to be associated with the most heinous forms of godless cruelty the world has ever known. Because over the closing decades of the 19th century, the emergent millionaire classes of Europe and America used Darwin's theory to explain away the morally repugnant social disparities of the modern industrial revolution by passing off the notion that their obscene accumulations of wealth was the final result of the highly intelligent, creative application of their strong work ethic, while the ordinary working classes and the poor had supposedly been destined to struggle along because they were naturally lazy, intellectually dull, and morally retarded genetic inferiors. Because in the opinion of most social Darwinists, the 7 out of every 10 children of the living God that they referred to as human weeds and useless eaters were actually unworthy of life itself, much less the privilege of reproducing their own kind. And because they were a burden to society who really needed to be put out of their misery, social Darwinists were strongly opposed to the development of mental asylums and social welfare programs because they only encouraged the poor to have more children. All of which lies exactly opposite to the well-known teachings of sacred scripture that demand compassionate understanding and creative goodwill towards the poor, as well as the widow and the orphan. In America, the term eugenics very quickly became the publicly coded shorthand for the subjugation, sterilization, and eventual elimination of the black and brown skinned races that still continues down to this very day. For example, during the opening decades of the 20th century, 32 states passed laws resulting in the involuntary forced sterilization of 64,000 American citizens, most of whom were poor women of color, female prisoners, and the legally vulnerable mental patients that authorities classified as emotionally unstable, which is one of the reasons why recent reports regarding the involuntary sterilization of female detainees at government-run immigration facilities were especially disturbing in light of America's unhappy, long history of medical crimes against humanity that even as recently as 4 decades ago coerced an entire third of all Puerto Rican women of childbearing age into becoming sterilized through taxpayer-funded birth control programs run by the federal government. Now, the morally bankrupt contempt for so-called inferiors, lying at the heart of social Darwinism, also carried over to the wildlife and livestock populations in a way that it's come back to threaten the very existence of every living creature all over the entire planet. Because most human illnesses have been found to originate among wildlife, while many scientists have even gone on to estimate that 3 out of every 4 newly emerging infectious diseases came from animals. So it really should come as no great surprise to learn the nation's raw meat packing plants were inadvertently transformed into industrial-sized super spreaders after the federal government intervened with the direct order compelling these plants to continue working their shifts, even in spite of the fact that in many places up to 20% of all line workers were known to be infected with the deadly coronavirus.
A stark, alarming reality this morning. 36 states seeing an increase in new coronavirus cases, all the states there in red. You need to notice when you look at this map, there's something else remarkable. No states in green, Allison, which means what? There are 0 states showing a decline in cases right now?
Yeah, and the last time we saw a map that looked like this was early April.
Okay. Joining us now is Professor William Haseltine. He's a former professor at Harvard Medical School and chair and president of Access Health International. His forthcoming autobiography, My Lifelong Fight Against Disease, is out next week. So no states in decline, Professor. 50,000 plus new cases reported in the last 24 hours. Hospitalizations at a level we have not seen since the end of August. We've been worried about this possible winter surge. It's not even a month into fall, and we're seeing this alarming increase. So what does that tell you?
Well, it tells us that we don't have this pandemic, this epidemic under control. And I'm extremely concerned that the president is being advised by people who speak of herd immunity. Herd immunity is another word for mass murder.
Now, Daedalus was a skilled architect and wise craftsman who lived in ancient times. And according to the story, a king named Minos ordered him to build a complex maze in order to imprison a man-eating minotaur. But shortly after fulfilling his wish, the king betrayed the great builder, who soon found himself imprisoned deep within the walls of the very same trap he had just built for the king. And in so many ways, the story of Daedalus represents the current fate of the human family that suddenly finds itself completely trapped and surrounded by a cruel army of deadly forces that were actually set into motion long before anyone living today was ever born. But rather than giving up and losing hope, the wise builder devised a daring escape plan that involved creating a set of flying wings made up from the only materials available at the time. However, in this particular case, the most vitally important available commodity turned out to be the abundant supply of altruistic compassion, motivating Daedalus to save his young son's life, who had been unjustly imprisoned as well, which bears out Darwin himself, who claimed the very survival of the human species has always been almost entirely dependent on this naturally evolved adaptive trait. And we will further learn as we go along that unselfish love for love's sake also appears to represent the life-giving golden key to unlocking the greatest creative potentials of the human family. 32,000 Americans die, while another 67,000 are seriously injured by firearms every year, which actually boils down to the fact that on a typical day in the United States, 21 children will be shot and 4 will die, while 63 fully adult, mostly white males commit suicide with a gun, and law enforcement officials killed 3 American citizens in the line of duty. Another 100 will be shot to death by a fellow citizen, while 200 additional victims will be lucky enough to survive their injuries. But by the time the sun goes down, 1 American citizen will either be seriously wounded or die from a gunshot injury every 6 minutes out of the 365 days of every single year. Now, according to a recent study from the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, the entire range of costs from the earliest paramedic response to a shooting scene on through to the final incarceration of the perpetrator averages out to $2.3 million after the total cost for every stage of the process have been added together, while non-fatal shootings typically average out somewhere around $900,000. Unfortunately, traditional attempts to manage the never-ending plague of interpersonal American violence initially led policymakers to invest 6% of the gross domestic product into the incarceration industry, on the way toward becoming the world's biggest jailer that spends 2 American tax dollars to incarcerated citizens for every dollar it spends to educate them, while the true costs of our short-sighted tunnel vision would finally be paid in full by the needless pain and suffering growing out from the fact that ever since 1979 at least, the nation's leading healthcare experts consistently warn against the deeply embedded glorification of violence and cruelty throughout the multi-billion-dollar sports and entertainment industries, whose poisonous destruction continuously spreads throughout the entire social spectrum, exactly like a highly infectious, contagious virus. And we can clearly see the final results of this untreated social malignancy that was allowed to fester throughout America's urban ghettos and barrios until its deadly presence erupted forth to afflict Americans of every race, creed, and color by means of the 486 mass shootings occurring throughout the United States by the end of the month of September of 2020. While the August 2nd issue of the Wall Street Journal detailed the sharp rise of homicides spreading across large American cities that signal a continuous, widespread safety risks prevailing in addition to the coronavirus and a devastating economic recession, along with the widespread backlash against the reckless brutality of America's broken police system. And so, the chaotic forces overwhelming our daily lives are very forcefully directing our attention toward the long-term need for a new and completely restructured 21st century social service toolbox. And just like the homeowner who never bothers to treat individual blades of crabgrass because he or she understands the thing that really needs attention is the soil. So today, our highest hopes lie with learning how to effectively treat the socially diseased cultural topsoil that constantly produces so many emotionally dangerous, bloodthirsty killers throughout the wealthiest nation to ever exist over the entire course of history. Now, the previous workshop briefly discussed the groundbreaking research conclusions regarding the dynamic spread of happiness in a large social network. They clearly describe the way human beings naturally pass along obesity and other health-related behaviors all throughout their most intimate social networks for up to 3 degrees of separation. But truly understanding American violence in terms of a widespread public health crisis most definitely requires a uniform means for systematically measuring the overall health of the collective mind as a whole. And while psychogenic disease is the clinical name for physical conditions arising from deeply buried psychiatric disorders, in the case of mass psychogenic illness, we have the rapid spread of pathological symptoms throughout a given population where no known viral or bacterial agent has been clearly associated with the contagion. Now, the modern French term for madness of the many probably offers the most accurate description of the senseless, widespread destruction dominating our daily headlines and nightly news broadcasts. And it also just so happens that the 8th chapter from retired Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman's Pulitzer Prize-nominated research masterpiece is called Killing in America: What Are We Doing to Our Children? And it is here, from his unique perspective as a highly experienced therapist who understands far better than most of us just exactly how the human mind works, that this vitally important research makes its greatest contribution. Because Colonel Grossman's 4-decade-long investigation into the psychological cost of learning to kill in war and society eventually led him to conclude constant exposure to hyper-aggressive, bloody violence through movies, television, organized sports, and recreational video games profoundly affects the parts of the brain that regulate emotional sensitivity and human empathy. While, according to another highly respected, well-known study from the University of Michigan, the average American child is seeing 16,000 televised murders by the time he or she turns 18. And indeed, according to the very same report, programs especially designed for children very often contain more violence than adult programs. And even worse yet, these extremely violent storylines are very often closely combined with humor. Now, Colonel Grossman's vitally important research also went on to describe just exactly how constantly saturating the mind with shocking images of mindless cruelty all throughout the critically important developmental years imparts the exact same emotional impact as the carefully planned training regimens that were very intentionally designed to break down the human heart's naturally inborn resistance to killing when very young American soldiers were being prepared for combat in Vietnam.
The little boy in Paducah, Kentucky had never fired a pistol before in his life. Stole a .22 caliber pistol from a neighbor's house, fired 2 magazines of ammo on a previous night, comes in his school and opens fire in a prayer circle out in front of the school, Paducah, Kentucky. He fires 8 shots. He gets 8 kids on 8 hits on 8 different kids, 5 of them headshots, the other 3 upper torsos. And he had trained on the video games. Google video games and marksmanship. Doug Gentile, a recent research demonstrating irrefutably that the video games teach marksmanship skills. Also, these are not video games, they're murder simulators. They're mass murder simulators.
And so, even at this point, the ancient proverb claiming the brightest stars only shine at night quite literally points us toward the highest hope the heart is able to know, even in spite of the merciless spirit of heartless cruelty that currently darkens our noonday sun and haunts our hopeless midnights. Because the timeless message from the old and wisest cultures of the human family reveals the blessed assurance of the sacred notion that even in spite of all appearances to the contrary, the only true and lasting reality above and beyond the visible universe is the flowing river of divine supreme love springing forth from the heart of heaven. And while the sacred Nile of ancient Egypt was originally considered to be the exact earthly reflection of this highest heavenly flow, according to the wise words of the well-known ancient teacher, it also served as the final full measure of the lawful and orderly universal flux that ultimately rules over all things seen and unseen, whereby change is the Lord of the universe, because it contains elements both of the old and the new at any given moment of the process. Consequently, where night ends, their day begins. And where summer begins, their spring ends. And also, where mortal life ends, their spiritual life begins. Now, there are very few places where the earthly operation of the universal flux can be more clearly observed above and beyond the continuously ongoing chaos prevailing over today's most socially challenged urban communities. And after we get right down to it, all human suffering everywhere, all injustice, and every other form of murderous mayhem, all boils down to nothing more and nothing less than a plain and simple question of love. And somehow, at the level of its strongly felt but rarely acknowledged deepest inner recesses, the human family fully realizes the most vitally important, very first life-giving step back towards its original state of primordial happiness can only be recovered through the lawful and orderly, unconditional surrender to the highest expressions of divine love supreme in the exact same way they were described in the New Testament Sermon on the Mount. While it also just so happens that the ancient language roots of the modern English words understand, order, star, and stellar can all be traced directly back to the sacred attributes of the divine ancestors of 1,000 names, who is universally revered on every continent across the face of the planet, from a very early point that most probably dates back sometime around 30,000 years before there ever was in England or an English language. And so here we learn the remotely ancient notion that the goddess is love appears to have been a widely accepted, unquestioned truth long before the initial emergence of the very earliest written languages, because the current form of the word disaster has been partly made up from the prehistoric description of the unhappy point that stands opposite to, distant, and far apart from whatever term it has been attached to, which in the case of the word disaster precisely describes the mental, emotional, and spiritual despair that lies directly opposed to, distant, and far apart from the joyful presence of the highest supreme good. Which brings us back to the very first basic principle that clearly reveals there's not a single earthly condition that cannot be vastly improved, if not completely healed over, by the properly balanced application of the divine circle. While as a matter of fact, if the truth be told, there's not a single earthly condition that could possibly carry the slightest hope of truly lasting improvement without the life-giving, healing power of love in all its various expressions. So at this point, the final and most important question becomes just exactly how can we learn to intelligently channel this dynamic healing force in a way that quickly brings immediate relief to the long-standing pain and suffering of our broken-hearted human family. And to that end, we can hardly imagine a better starting point beyond the inspired doctrine whose whole entire message evolves around the only kingdom worthy of the heavenly name that lies precisely within the exactly direct center of each and every heartbeat.